Thank you, Ed, and I'm happy to be here this bright and early in the morning. I was genuinely wondering what I did to make Ed hate me, but I think this is actually probably a really good start. I'm way too short for this. I think this is probably a really good start to your Saturday morning, especially if you were out late last night, because this is a fairly gentle presentation. There's not a lot of theory and technobabble going on here. It's actually mostly a horror story. And if you're feeling any pain this morning, I invite you to share in mine. I actually have to apologize to Ed because Ed teaches a fantastic web design class at McGill, and that's where a lot of us learned very good project management skills, and none of them are going to be displayed in this project. I do want you to know that I learned them, though, and in other contexts I'm able to apply them. Obviously, spending this kind of money in this short of a timeline isn't a class that they offer in library school, and that's because it's never going to happen. Nobody's ever going to say to you, here's $50,000, spend it. You have 3 weeks to do so. But that, of course, is what this presentation is about, because it happened to me. And I should also preface it by saying I am, of course, incredibly grateful that somebody gave me $50,000, even though I had to spend it in 3 weeks. We ended up with something that we would have never had before. It wasn't even something that we'd been planning on having, which is, of course, part of the difficulty. But we ended up with a digital repository, which is pretty great, I guess, for none of our own money. And I think really, in light of what the presenters were talking about yesterday, you can consider this a presentation on why somebody would do the exact opposite of everything they recommended. So this is why somebody would end up with an out-of-the-box solution, no fantastic exit strategy, no long-term planning, because of circumstances. So please don't judge me. As Ed mentioned, I do have a background in sociology, and I am going to torment you all this morning with a little bit of social theory. It's a habit I can't quite kick, sorry. But when this money came our way, I couldn't help but think of my first thesis, which was on the gift. And I used the work of the good old fellow Jacques Derrida, because he, very insightfully, as he always does, looked at the German word for the gift and noticed that it had the same root as the word poison. And I think that was very apropos when dealing with this money. It was certainly a gift, and a very generous one, but there was a little bit of a challenge in using it. And as I get going, I will also apologize because this Prezi moves a little bit. As any of you who've used Prezi know, you might be subject to motion sickness, so feel free to put your head down and close your eyes at any time. Nobody will think it had anything to do with last night. And I couldn't do it, so you might as well have the chance. So the prehistory to this project starts in the summer of 2011, when the head of IT at WPL, the Winnipeg Public Library System, the library system that I work in, found a pot of money. Not literally, this is a figurative finding of a pot of money. There was no rainbow involved. But he discovered that there was a pot of $50,000 that another department hadn't spent that was earmarked for a digitization project. And it had sort of been offered to WPL as likely people who would know what to do with money that was earmarked for a digitization project. Unfortunately, that's not really the case. In Winnipeg, we tend to focus more on outreach and community projects. The Millennium Library is a downtown library, and if anybody's visited downtown Winnipeg, we're more pressed to deal with the people who actually live in our library physically. That's kind of where our priorities are. If we had $50,000 we could do anything with, we would have hired another social worker, because it's pretty useful to give librarians advice for where to find the nearest homeless shelter. So this $50,000 for digitization wasn't something that anybody really knew what to do with. My colleagues at the time kind of tried to look around and see if there was anything that seemed useful to digitize, and they came across the Henderson directories. And I don't know where Peter is, but he knows all about the Henderson directories. And any of you who work with archives and are probably involved with anything to do with the Prairie Provinces know what Henderson directories are. Those who don't, they're a directory of names, businesses, buildings, and they were actually, they started, well, our versions I think started in 1905, and they were actually researchers who went door to door and asked people, do you live here, do you rent, do you own, where do you work, what kind of business is that? So they're incredibly complete directories of everything that was happening in the city at the time. They do also contain city council information, so all of the demographics of the city at the time, and they show kind of the new grants for streets and building planning. They're very useful, very rich historical resources, but quite painful to look through if you're trying to find the year that Charlie Chaplin lived in Winnipeg for 6 months, which is 1907, I think, if anybody's curious. But look, you have to spend a lot of time looking through them. So we thought, hey, this is great. We can digitize these. They sent out an RFI, got some information about the actual digitizing process, and then, sort of as an afterthought, decided to talk to University of Alberta, as they have the Peel Prairie Archives there, and just get some advice from them. Well, unfortunately, or fortunately, Peel very fantastically offered to digitize the Hendersons for free. This was our reaction, which was, that's awesome, oh darn, because they were the only thing that we'd identified as being worth digitizing. So they kind of got started on this project of shipping the Hendersons off. They had to literally pry them from the cold, cold hands of our local history librarian, who honestly cried when he had to see them go. And Peel started doing some amazing work with them, and everybody completely forgot about the money. Because we were getting work done for free, why would we need to spend the money? I call this the prehistory because I hadn't actually started at WPL yet. I didn't start until February of the next year, by which point everyone had forgotten the money. So when I started, it was never mentioned to me. Oh, there's my ID card. When I started, I had a massive portfolio of working on the mobile app and doing some usability for the first time ever for the website and redoing our tech programs and starting staff training, because we haven't actually done staff training for 10 years. Large, massive projects, none of which had anything to do with digitization, because I didn't know about the money. Until what I call D-Day, which was April 3rd, 2012. And this was when my boss found out that the money was going to be scooped from us, that the city was going to take the money back at the end of April. So this is the first time I heard about the $50,000. And it was literally 3 weeks before the money was going to disappear. And that was fun. My boss's perspective on it was that we could just give the money back, because they had done what they could to think of something to do with it. They didn't have anything identified as a priority for digitization. They didn't care, so they could give the money back. If you've ever worked in a public context, you probably know that giving money back means you're never getting any ever again for anything else. Saying we don't need $50,000 additional dollars in our budget is like saying, well, we already have a big enough budget, which is not true. So we thought that I thought it was worth making one last stab at trying to use the money and trying to use it effectively in a way that would actually have some value. But it was a little bit difficult. I'm not an archivist. I'm also not a tech person. I have a background slightly in digital repositories. I worked for the Inter-American Development Bank when they were installing DSpace, so have an awareness of that, and gave some advice to the UN Convention on Biological Diversity on setting up something similar, but this isn't my area. And I don't think it does justice to an archives degree to suggest that it ever would be in 3 weeks. But we did what we could. So again, apologies to all of the archivists, because this is a really quick and dirty example, not a well thought out 3-year plan of study. So by the next day, and this is how quickly things started moving, the next day we decided to build a digital repository. And part of the reason for this is because initially when they'd started looking at the project, they'd tried to think of things that they could digitize, but they hadn't thought at all about how they were going to present that information. And from my experiences working on DSpace, which was a 2-year project that of course took 3 years to complete and cost thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars, the actual system itself was certainly going to take a long time. And at WPL, we have no in-house web programming capabilities whatsoever. We have a very small IT department that are essentially there to work as a help desk, to help the library systems with their basic computing needs. But we don't have any web programmers at all. So if we started digitizing things and just had a whole bunch of digital materials with nowhere to put it, they would never end up anywhere. They would just be these lost orphans. So we decided to build the repository, but of course at this point it was still an empty shell. We had no content, thanks to Peel, very kindly, doing our Hendersons. So we had a little bit of a panic over that. Again, from working on the DSpace project, I was fairly aware that identifying materials and pre-processing materials was going to take more than 3 weeks to do, particularly because we don't have a lot of rare books. We're not that kind of library system. We do maintain vertical files, but they're not useful. And we just don't have a ready collection. So we talked to all of the librarians in the system and kind of said, do you have any ideas for things that would be worthwhile getting into a digital format? And in the meantime, while we were sort of desperately searching for content, I did the quick and dirty couple of days' work to try and find out what current archival standards were and what we were trying to actually build up to those standards. It didn't focus as much on process, and again, I apologize for that. We weren't as concerned about getting our SIPs and everything in order as we were about making sure that we were scanning to the right DPI, that we were getting enough metadata in there that things would have use. Those were kind of the things that we were focusing on because we knew that we'd have to get a system that could accommodate for that. 4 days later, we had a mass brainstorming session with most of our outreach librarians, a couple of the other people who are just interested in local history, our actual local history librarian. And at this point, it became really obvious that people in public libraries are absolute geniuses at not spending money. Because every idea they came up with was free, or incredibly minimal, or something we could do with already existing library staff, because that's how we think in public libraries. So the ideas we came up with here are pretty much all of our community engagement ideas, and I think they really make the project a lot richer. They certainly didn't help me spend the money, but that's fine. This is where we kind of came up with, this is where we had our preliminary identification of content, which is that one of our librarians knew a postcard collector and was pretty sure that he would be willing to give us his collection. And the added benefit to this was that his collection was already organized, which, librarians don't even think about, but collectors are probably better at that than we are. So we had potentially the promise of a very interesting historical postcard collection. And we then started riffing on what we could do to get the actual context for these postcards, how we could get more people involved, and how we could get the general public involved. So that's where we came up with the idea of doing some digitization days. So inviting the public in to come and scan their own personal history artifacts, with the understanding, of course, that they would become part of a public domain project and that they would be relinquishing any rights to those images. But in exchange, they would be getting high-quality scans of them. And possibly also exposing those to historians who would be able to give them more context. Because that's one of the things that we really wanted to be able to do, was get the local history community, which is very active in Winnipeg in very particular ways, get them involved and get as much collaboration from them as possible, because we're not historians. I couldn't identify 2/3 of the locations in these images, but there are certainly people out there who can. The collector himself can give you an encyclopedia on every postcard because he's done research. But he certainly also recognized that there were people in the city who knew even more than him. They just didn't tend to leave their houses very much, which I'll kind of talk about at the end, because we'll get there. So we had potential content. We had a couple of really neat ideas for ways to get people involved. And we seemed to have some interest among other library staff. So the very next day, we whacked together a budget and a project plan. There wasn't time to do a SWOT analysis. There were no PERT charts. It would have been really silly for me to do a work structure flow, because everything would have been assigned to me, and I probably would have had crushing depression and not worked on this. So we did a very, very quick Gantt chart, because as you can tell from the date, sorry, just to go back, I'm already at April 11th. And I've got till April 30th, and there's a couple of weekends in there, so I don't even have really, I think I've got 10 days left. So this is the budget. You probably don't care about the direct line items, but there's a budget in there for purchasing scanners. Oh, I should mention, one of the reasons we didn't buy hardware with it is because 6 months prior to this money being identified, we'd spent a large amount of money buying the top-of-the-line book scanner. So we already had one. It wasn't being used already, so we knew that buying two was certainly not going to be a good use of the money. Although part of these participation projects are aiming to get that book scanner into a little bit more use, because we already spent a lot of money on it, so might as well get it used. So there's a couple of just flatbed scanners, so that they're portable, so that we can do our digitization days at different branches across the systems. The software for those with some rudimentary OCR in it. And then the scanning of the actual postcards and the software, because we couldn't do it in-house. We already knew by this point that there was no way that I was going to be able to spend even 2 weeks solid, dedicated time trying to figure out an open source solution or something that I could build myself. That just wasn't a possibility. We really wanted something open source, but we knew that even if we were going to go that route, we were going to have to pay somebody else to do it for us, which conveniently took a large chunk of our budget away, which was a relief. There was also money in the budget at this point for some catalogers to help with ingest. We don't have a library school in Winnipeg, and we don't have one nearby, which makes it a little bit difficult. We don't ever get free interns. So we had to, we would have had to actually pay. Those are the kinds of projects that I would love to have an intern for, but sorry. And we gave timelines. And part of the reason that we gave somewhat unrealistic timelines is because we wanted to convince them not to take the money away on April 30th. Our finance department pays net 30, which means that for us to actually have spent the money by April 30th, all of our bills would have had to have been in before April 1st, which was an impossibility. So we were hoping that at least if we could show that the funds were encumbered, they were promised, they wouldn't scoop the money away from us. So that's what this project plan with a really nice tight 1 week to prepare an RFP. That's what this is about. April 19th was the first time the collector was back in town and able to meet with us. And this was probably the most nerve-wracking day of the project for me, because this was when we'd find out if we had any content or not. And he was quite different than I had expected. Postcard collectors are otaku. There's no doubt about that. All of the pejorative implications of it, unfortunately, apply, as well as the delightfully nerdy parts of it, and some of the social skills, too. Our collector didn't fit that stereotype at all. Our collector is a lovely, lovely man. His name is Rob McGinnis. And he collects postcards out of love and joy and likes sharing them. He doesn't really consider his collection intensely private or proprietary, which is fantastic for us. He also is very well connected with the postcard community, and so he is very well aware of the people who do feel that way about their collections. And he has all sorts of strategies for how we can crack them, which is kind of exciting. He brought with him a fellow from the Manitoba Historical Society, who is their unofficial webmaster and a giant geotagging fan, apparently. And we didn't realize that. We sort of thought this was going to be a conversation about, you know, can we use your images? Do you mind sharing them with people? Do you want to reserve any rights? This turned out to be them grilling us for hours about how we were going to display the images, what kind of metadata we wanted to use, if there was going to be any geocaching opportunities. It was amazing. It was really fun because they knew their stuff and they really wanted to make sure that we knew what we were talking about before they would commit. It was also nerve-wracking because this is things that I had crammed into my head in the last 2 weeks. So getting tested on it without having been prepared to study beforehand was quite fun. We seemed to have checked all the boxes, though. They really just wanted to make sure that the images were going to be collaborative, and I thought that was really neat. That was their first priority, was that other people were going to be able to get involved with each of the images, that they were hopefully going to be able to spark a dialogue, because that's what these collectors do. They hang out together and they throw a couple of images down on the table and they try and show off who knows more about that image. And if that streetcar is from 1907 or if it's from 1908, and how you can tell because the design of the streetlights had changed. And it's amazing esoteric knowledge, and they really, I think, wanted a public forum to start showing it off. So we got their agreement, and we could go ahead. You can see how close we are to the end of April here. So we met at the beginning of the final week with a scanning company, a local scanning company, who were already in our system because they're the ones who sold us the book scanner. And the reason for that is because we're part of the municipality. To get anybody added onto our payroll is a process that takes months. Again, making it very difficult to spend money in 3 weeks when any amount over $2,000 has to go to public tender, any new vendor has to go through this incredible vetting process. So we really were trying to work with what we already had, and we just happened to have a company that was on the payroll for something else that we could try and slip through. So we met with them, and I'd already luckily prepared metadata guidelines, which was kind of strange because we didn't even know what system we were putting it into. But I figured it would likely either be Dublin Core or perhaps something similar to mods. So I'd made a crosswalk between the two and kind of figured out all of our fields, and in this meeting we were able to provide them with preliminary guidelines, talk about the kind of metadata we wanted them as the scanners to provide versus the kind of metadata that us as librarians were going to process. And then finally we sat down with our director to kind of get his sense, and this is April 25th, so you might be getting a slight sense of premonition about how the April 30th deadline's looking at this point. But we wanted to get his sense of what roadblocks we were going to likely hit. As the director, he's very close to our corporate city structure, so he's a lot more aware of the politics of what's going on there and the fun things that are likely to happen along that road, which is a road that we always have to cross for anything we do within the library. And we also met with our head of IT just to find out what IT had in the pipeline and what kind of support IT we're going to be able to provide. The answer was predictably almost none, but they'd give us moral support and cheer us on, which is great. My IT department are fantastic cheerleaders. I think you all just got a mental image, and I'm really sorry to my IT department for that. Okay, so April 30th, my deadline. you probably have a sense of what the number here is going to be, and that is a big grand zero. Luckily, though, we'd kind of done enough work to show them that we had a plan. We didn't tell them when the plan had been developed. We kind of played innocent and said, well, this is what we were intending to do all along 3 days ago. And if you scoop the money now, you know, you're disrupting this entire Gantt chart that's super well prepared and is already in everybody, i.e. mine, workflow. And yeah, so we maybe fudged things a little bit, and I am sure they are not awake at 8 o'clock in the morning in Winnipeg to watch this, so I can say that. These aren't being posted after, are they? Okay. Yeah. And what was the excuse? Creative video editing in case anything incriminating goes on the record. I don't think they really care that much. But so April 30th came and went, and we had zero funds spent. The hitches that had been identified when we spoke with our director and our head of IT, of course, came true. The first big hurdle, and I'll go over this really quickly, was our ITS expenditure request. This is something that we have to go to the corporate city IT department for whenever we want to spend any money. This includes amounts under $2,000 on a new IT project. And we have to explain things to them, like what the purpose of the project is. We have to explain to them there is absolutely no security risk, and good God, we are certainly not doing anything social, because they're really terrified of social media. We still don't have a social media standard in our city. And again, I am glad that they're not they're not seeing me admit that. But they really don't like collaboration. So we kind of just didn't include that in our proposal. And also had to answer any questions they had, like whether this system was going to exist on one computer in the library or if it would be available online. We intended for it to be available online in case anybody's curious. Yeah, so that took a while to get over that hurdle. It was illustrative. And then the second hurdle was the actual RFP process. And there was no getting out of this, and there was no speeding this up. And this took a great deal longer than was expected, because the RFP that the city provided us for was for materials acquisitions. And a materials acquisitions RFP is very different than a service RFP, and includes things like warranties. So, you know, if it breaks within a year, they'll replace it for free, which conjures just such a beautiful image in my head when talking about a digital repository. And unfortunately, also, there is a great deal of legalese in our RFPs about things like warranties and liabilities. And as we went through the RFP process, a number of the software vendors that I'd contacted initially that I'd really liked their projects, and that includes Greenstone and the team that do Archivematica, they couldn't meet those legal requirements because they're not that sort of not that sort of software. So they dropped out, unfortunately, but we did get some bidders eventually on the RFP process. You can see here that it took almost 2 months for the RFP to even go out. And I'm going to skip this part. We also have a very heavy-duty matrix that we have to follow, where price is automatically worth 40% of our weighting. And we kind of had to skew it to really try to make the other weighting be in the points of difference between the different systems. So we wanted for sure something that was OAI PMH, and we really wanted the collaboration, search and discovery parts to be as good as possible. I had a holiday planned, because of course this project was supposed to be done at the end of April, so I took off and went to Indonesia. And that's me in front of Krakatoa at 5 in the morning. It was exciting. We nearly died a couple of times, for real. And when I came back from this incredibly exciting holiday, they told me again, the money's getting scooped. This time for real. This time, for real, you have to spend it by the end of July, which is a week away, and I've been on holiday for 3 weeks. So this time we did it, kind of, even though we currently had 0 funds spent to date. We ran out, and immediately figured out which software we wanted. We cut a PO for the scanning, even though the work hadn't been done. And I do not recommend ever paying for scanning in advance, but we were doing what we could. And we purchased the scanners, and we purchased the software we could. So by July 31st, we had managed to spend a fair bit of the money. $7,000. But, again, we spent it. We had things to show for it. And our bid was finally awarded to Content DM. Again, our legal department had a problem with some of the information they provided. Just a hint, if you're ever responding to an RFP, and they say very specifically not to include additional information, don't include additional information, because you're just giving legal stuff to arm themselves with. And so we did finally get it. You can see that it was past the point that we were supposed to have the funds encumbered by, but we just used that good old practice of backdating POs, and we managed to get it paid. So in the end, because our software ended up being $20,000 less, and we weren't able to spend any money whatsoever on people because this was a capital budget, we finally managed to spend $20,000. It took a lot longer than 3 weeks, but we did. It was all on things we decided within the first 3 weeks. And we talked Content DM into charging us for an additional year of support. So we kind of planned ahead a little bit there. And yeah. Oh, and then this was an important watershed in the project, the invention of the peanut butter ginger snap. And you are all free to go home and work with this, because we had a lot of trouble getting servers, because again, that has to go through corporate IT, and my IT department rushed it through, and so this was how we celebrated. There are no nut allergies in my library, thank goodness. And so finally, September 5th, we had Content DM set up. We reviewed the scanning results, which were terrible. Don't prepay for scanning, ever. They're redoing everything. And the end of September, we got some controlled vocabularies in there. We have a lot of indigenous materials, and those are flagged as quite sensitive in our community. So, and that's something that most of the existing controlled vocabularies are terrible at dealing with. There have been rumors of a project working on getting an actual Canadian Indigenous controlled vocabulary global project going. Right now we're using the BC subject headings, but there's a huge issue with that, partially because the current vocabularies tend to use the legal terms, which is the Indian Status Act, which has pretty unfair associations. So we have a lot of work to do still around those, and it's kind of great. We've got the librarian at the Canadian Human Rights Museum interested in working on that, and our outreach librarians interested in working on that. And we also got some test PDFs from the Henderson directories that U of A are doing for us, so we had some additional materials. And then the plans for the future, which I have to rush through, include identifying actual in-house materials. And part of an extension of this is inviting other libraries to contribute. The Human Rights Museum have indicated an interest in it, and some of the rural libraries might be interested as well, because nobody's giving them $50,000, so they are more than welcome to use our system. Getting the Hendersons in, and this one I'm particularly excited about, partially because we might get a local brewery to help sponsor this, but again, that's off the record. Getting the local historian community in and doing a digital version of throwing some postcards down on the table and encouraging people to show off how much they know about them. So doing slideshows and transcribing and recording, because we do have oral histories already on the site as well. Getting some of that really rich ideas from people who don't like to leave their house by bribing them with beer and the chance to see things that they might not have seen yet, because the site won't be technically live at that point. Our postcard collector, as I said, very well connected in the collector community, and he has dropped so many hints that all of the postcard collectors are jealous of him already and want to know how they can get in on the project. And he's been amazing. He's even told the main people who sell postcards on eBay that if they're ever selling Winnipeg-specific postcards, to include a note with his contact information so that he can tell them about this project as well. Because there's a benefit to the postcard collectors as well. They don't care about the image rights. They care about the bragging rights. And so if they can have their names associated with their postcards and show off to more people, they're totally into it. Also, this way, they're getting high-quality digital scans of their images, and they don't have to worry as much about touching them. Ours all come in little plastic sleeves, and they're meticulously annotated. It's pretty great. And then finally, the public component is going to be starting in February of next year, which is going to be the digitization days for the public, where we'll have our scanning stations set up, and people can bring in 3 to 5 images. We'll scan them, and we'll get the stories behind them as the metadata, and having, of course, some local history talks to tie in with the collection. Okay. I think that's my time. I'll just throw up really quick. No. Saturday morning, 9 a.m. That might be taken the wrong way. I was going to just very quickly, this is sort of what we've got here. And, you guys can ask questions now if you have any.
I realize that Content DM comes with a whole administrative interface piece. I'm just curious, as far as storage, where things like S3 in the abstract or the Internet Archive fit into all of this.
I'm not sure that I understand the Internet.
Excuse me.
I'm not an archivist.
No, but I mean, well, the Internet Archive, you know, they're pretty liberal in what they'll take. They'll take anything.
Oh, okay. Sorry. So other things that we would contribute.
I mean, you were talking about the mechanics of cost and the IT piece, and you know, all the RFP nightmares is a terrible parallel to our world. But I'm just wondering, like, the archive will just take this stuff, and they'll host it pretty much forever.
Well, I guess it was partially negotiating that might have taken us more time than buying something. Okay. Partially, and we didn't want a free solution.
Okay, but I mean, the other part is just that.
The point wasn't to spend money that we didn't need to spend, but the point was that we had some money, and one of the main reasons we went with Content DM, and it kind of goes against personal principles I had, but it really worked for our library because an idiot can use it. And long term, that might be the only capability we were sure that we'd have. So their interface is incredibly easy to use, although I managed to break it multiple times, so it's not as easy as it sounds. But long term, it didn't rely on somebody with my principles and my time and my energy. This is something that we could always have somebody contributing to. It's kind of a cop-out answer, I know, but
no, it's a perfectly reasonable one. I mean, it's a yearly license.
Yeah.
But that's fine. Like, there's nothing wrong with that.
No,
in principle.
and weirdly enough, it's easy for us to get commitment for a $1,000 yearly license, which is really all this is. It's easier to get commitment for that than for 20 additional hours of a librarian's time. It just the way our system is set up. Librarian's time is hard to get. Like this ended up being less than 1% of my time that was dedicated to it. So I feel like I'm about to get brained with maple syrup. Anyway, the images are actually really neat. I just want to show one before Ed. Okay. There's a ton of strike images because that's one of the big things in Winnipeg's history. Oh, no, it looks like it's broken. That error message isn't good. This isn't actually live, which is why you'll see the numbered URL rather than the actual URL. Okay, well, you're not going to get to see them. Sorry. If you want to go to that numbered URL, you can probably poke around and see some of the things there. Huge parts of it are still broken because I did that the day before I came here and can't fix it from here. But there are some pretty neat postcards up there, and a lot of them have to do with Winnipeg winter scenes. We're a stereotype. And one of them actually is subtitled something about going ice skating. Somebody wrote out